Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of IFIX P-Daughter Journal Club. So we have three articles from October 2019 and December 2019 editions of the Journal of Children's Orthopedics, and one article from JPO 2019, which will be presented by Jayant Sampath sir on supracondylar humerus fractures. So the first article will be presented by Dr. Dwan. This is from December 2019 edition of the JCO.
Good morning, everyone. So today's paper for discussion is migration percentage and odds of recurrence or subsequent surgery after treatment for hip subluxation in pediatric cerebral palsy. It's a meta-analysis and a systemic review. It was published in Journal of Children's Orthopedics. So the primary aim of the study was to determine the pooled odds ratio for failure of the treatment. And it compared various treatments like soft tissue procedures versus the femoral osteotomy. Other comparison was femoral osteotomy versus pelvic osteotomy alone. And the third was femoral osteotomy versus the combined femoral and pelvic osteotomies. And the secondary aim was to determine the mean change in migration percentage and along with or final migration percentage for each procedure. And the procedure included were botulinum toxin injections, soft tissue procedures, femoral osteotomy, pelvic osteotomy, and combined osteotomies. So this was a meta-analysis, and they included they searched for studies on the database from which were published from January 1953 to January 2017, and for the first one for odds ratio, all the studies were included if they compared at least two treatments and reported subluxation or redislocation, and all the RCTs, cohort and case control studies were eligible. However, they excluded the case reports or any case series reporting only one type of intervention. And for the second part of the study, where they checked for the migration change, all the studies who reported analysis and change in migration percentage and final percentage were included. And the data was then analyzed using meta-analysis software. So for the first part, for the odds ratio, total they could find 14 studies which met the inclusion criteria. And for the migration percentage, 24 studies were included. So these were the 14 studies that were included for the odds ratio. Here it is to see that they could not find any study which reported Botox versus any other treatment for subluxation or dislocation, and all the operated patients were almost GMFCS 4 and 5. None of the earlier like GMFCS 1 and 1 was included in the studies. In the combined versus femoral comparison, 45 hips out of 323 hips, that is 13%, have shown to have resubluxation or reoperations, and versus the 63 out of 303 hips that were treated with only femoral osteotomies. And in the femoral versus soft tissue, the patients that were treated with femoral osteotomies were showing less resubluxation or reoperation versus the 21 hips out of 31, that is 56% of patients showing reoperation or resubluxation after soft tissue surgery. And when they compared the only pelvic versus the only femoral osteotomies, so in 6 out of 13 hips that were treated, 46% that were treated with only pelvic osteotomies were shown to have resubluxation or reoperation, versus only 4 out of 23 hips, that is 17% of patients treated with femoral osteotomy showed the resubluxation. and the odds of resubluxation or reoperation were not statistically different for pelvic versus femoral osteotomy, like when they compared the odds ratio. So this was the final result they came up with. And here we can see the maximum studies were of combined versus the femoral osteotomies, and only 2 studies for the femoral osteotomy versus the soft tissue release, and 2 studies for pelvic versus femoral osteotomy. And these were the 24 studies that were included for the calculation of change in the migration percentage. And what they could see is the maximum change was seen in the patients who were operated with combined osteotomy. And there was no significant change in the migration percentage in the patients who were treated just with Botox, preoperatively and postoperatively. So out of the 24 studies were eligible, the combined pelvic and femoral osteotomy showed 60% improvement in the migration percentage post-operatively, while isolated pelvic osteotomy showed around 45% improvement. Isolated femoral osteotomy showed 33%. Soft tissue procedures showed 10%, and there was negligible improvement in the patients who were treated with Botox. There were a lot of limitations they could see in the study, and it was mostly due to variations in the outcomes reported. Like not all the studies were included in the study from 1953 to 2017. Also, like the patient characteristics differed between treatment groups. Like not all studies they could come up with same patient characteristics. Like as they said, the patients who were treated with both pelvic and femoral osteotomies were having a higher degree of dislocation. However, it was not same with the patients those were treated with soft tissue surgeries. And also the included studies were all comparative analysis, and also they were retrospective studies. None of them was a prospective study. And there was also insufficient data as to differentiate between different surgical techniques. Like they couldn't find like what in soft tissue procedures was done. Only hamstring release was done, or rectus femoris, or anything such. And the number of numbers presented for final migration percentage is actually a combination of improved and then whatever the remodeling takes place at the bony level for over the years. So it was also not like they could say that the immediate change in the migration percentage post surgery is greater than what it will be after 5 years of follow-up. So in conclusion, they said that soft tissue procedures provided a moderate improvement in migration percentage and are associated with a relatively high rate of subsequent surgery. And combined pelvic and femoral osteotomies provided the greatest improvement in migration percentage and had the lowest odds of subsequent resubluxation or redislocation. So the paper is open for discussion.
Yeah. So like any meta-analysis, this provides just a flavor of the day and very difficult to have any conclusion. So Anil, this was a very difficult paper to read and present, and you've done a very good job of analyzing what the paper wants to say. Any comments from anyone? Jayant, you want to say something about this paper out?
I think the landmark or watershed moment in cerebral palsy research is the introduction of GMFCS classification. So I think journals should make some sort of distinction about pre-GMFCS reporting and post-GMFCS reporting papers, because it's just completely changed the landscape. Because I've been practicing cerebral palsy pre and post that era. There's a huge difference in the way in which we look at a patient. I must admit, before we got the GMFCS classification and started widely reporting it, and this was around 2005, the way we looked at CP was completely different. And it seems like a very simple thing, but it's actually a profound change in the way we look at the child with CP, and the way we classify those children. And even Miller's paper, that's Anna Presedo's paper, which is a huge series, which looked at soft tissue surgery, does not report GMFCS. It was published in JBJS American. And he makes only two classifications, walkers and non-walkers. So that's a very, very um, uh, coarse way of classifying children according to walking status. So I think you should stop reporting uh, patients studies in my start include stop including studies in meta-analysis that don't report GMFCS classification. Just trash all the old work because it's not really helpful at all, and it might um, skew the data quite significantly. So just look at papers post 2005. Even if we have fewer number of studies, it will give us better, I think, more accurate data. But this paper makes intuitive sense.
Absolutely.
So, but factors like age and GMFCS level, they are far more, I think, helpful in decision making rather than what surgery you do. They are saying, yeah, Botox doesn't work, soft tissue surgery doesn't work so well. Yeah, that's all very well known. I don't think this meta-analysis really contributes. Uh, we should look at moving to the next level now. Okay, what is the age at which you should not do femoral and pelvic osteotomy? Those are the questions. What is the youngest age you can do a femoral and pelvic osteotomy? Those are the more, I think, helpful questions to practicing surgeons.
Absolutely. So basically what happens is the indications and age groups are completely different for all the indications. I think what I got from the paper, and they've sort of said it as a, reading in between the line, Botox is to increase the range of motion in a child who has persistent adductor tightness spasticity, and the therapist is not able to go ahead functionally. Soft tissue release you will do in a very young child where bony surgeries are not possible. Femoral osteotomy you will do once migration percentage is more than 30, and there is a you're seeing that the hip is being subluxated, and you will add a acetabular procedure once the acetabular index becomes more than 25. So indications are completely different, and hence to compare one procedure to other in terms of effectivity it's completely unjustified.
And the other thing now, which is the big confounding factor, is has the study been done in the context of a surveillance program or not?
Absolutely.
So that also makes a huge difference.
Huge difference,
about, when you operate on these children, when they actually turn up for treatment, etc., etc. So that is again has to be reported in studies.
Jayan, there are some papers where they say at a surveillance program, an early postural correction also helps to prevent migration of the hips. So these are all confounding factors. Yeah, which we need to do. Okay. So any other questions or any other comments on this paper? Otherwise, we can go to the next paper. Dwanil, well presented. So it actually at least gives you overview of things which are happening, and also tells you as a meta-analysis what are the problems with meta-analysis and the message which it gives.
Taral,
Bolna, haan.
I think the only predictor of the migration percentage in the young age is the GMFCS. If the child is going to do well, no, if he stands or does some upright activity, the hip does better than somebody who doesn't by 5 years of age.
Yeah, but there are some very few GMFCS 2, 3, 2, and 1 also who migrate the hips. So
no, but we are not talking about outliers. For general orthopedic pediatric young fellows,
4, 5,
clear
3,
message.
4, 5, and some of the
doesn't do that. Meta-analysis most of the times are a researcher's dream. They don't contribute to practical life.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So next, go to the next paper.
Yes, sir. So today's paper we are discussing is evolution of Lex Kaffe-Perthes disease following proximal femoral varus osteotomy performed in avascular stage. It's a prospective study done in Kasturba Medical College, Manipal, by Kumar Andres Hitesha, Benjamin Joseph, sir. It's a level 2 prognostic study and a prospective one. The aim for the study, as you know, in an untreated child, like Kaffe-Perthes disease follows a discrete stages of evolution of the disease, as explained in a modified Elizabethtown classification. Previous retrospective studies have noted alteration in the evolution of the disease by treatment early in the course of the disease, that is in 1A, 1B, and 2A. This study closely observes the pattern of evolution of LCPD following containment surgery in stage 1A, 1B, 2A of the disease by a proximal femoral varus osteotomy. The aim of the study is to learn pattern of changes in the femoral epiphysis with special reference to stage of fragmentation, and whether these different patterns of evolution affect the outcome of the disease, and whether these patterns of evolution influence the duration of the disease. There are three aims to learn. Methods, materials and methods. Inclusion criteria is early stages of the disease. Every patient was underwent a pre-operative perfusion MRI scan and regular follow-up with radiological data on each follow-up. The criteria for patient selection of surgery was based on previous studies of the author. As you know, containment is done in age more than 7 or less than 7 with exclusion in early stages. If exclusion is present, and only if the range of hip motion is normal. For each patient, there were total 25 patients in this study. Gadolinium enhanced perfusion MRI scan with within 2 weeks of diagnosis for each patient was done, and MRI perfusion scan was calculated. All patients underwent a subtrochanteric varus derosion open wedge osteotomy. Varus angulation was kept at 20 degrees and implant was a pre-bent dynamic compression plate. Strict non-weight bearing for six months was advised, and non-weight bearing walking with crutches and walkers were allowed. No braces were given to any patient. Each follow-up required an AP and a frog letter view. The disease was regarded as healed if no residual area of bony sclerosis was evident in the femoral epiphysis in both AP and lateral radiographs. The time interval from date of first radiograph on presentation to date at which the heal was regarded as the duration of the disease, and last all outcome was computed with a spherical deviation score. Results. The demographic result were the mean age of onset of the symptoms were 7.32 years, and the mean age of disease healing was 10.63 years. There were 22 boys in the studies and 3 girls. Right were left, 11 were left right-sided cases, and 13 were left-sided cases. And the stage of surgery was 1A in 1 patient and 1B in 24 patients. The pattern of the disease was, there were 4 patterns noted. There were typical fragmentation in 4 patients, bypassing fragmentation in 3 patients, abortive fragmentation in 6 patients, and atypical fragmentation with horizontal fissuring in total 12 patients. So they described each fragmentation as such that in the case of laying down from the towards the growth plate, either in the substance of avascular sclerotic bone or in the boundary between avascular and perfused bone. The fissure, this appears as a breach in the continuity of the articular margin of the bony epiphysis. As the disease evolves, fragmentation progresses, more fissures are seen. Lastly, the epiphysis appears to be broken into 3 or more fragments, and this is termed as stage 2B. And finally, new bone begins to form on the periphery of the avascular epiphysis towards the centripetal manner in stage 3 of the disease, and finally it progresses till that healing is complete. This was termed as typical fragmentation. Now, the second type of fragmentation they noted was bypassing fragmentation. In this condition, no fissures were noted on the radiographs. The continuity of the articular margin of the femoral epiphysis is maintained throughout the course of the disease. and the diffuse resorption appears to be occurring in the whole of the avascular bone, with the appearance of new bone simultaneously across the entire epiphysis. Sorry. Third was the abortive fragmentation they noted. In this case, early fragment did start, but there were only one or at the most two fissures were noted. It early fragment commences but does not progress, and the reconstitution rapidly supervenes, and again reabsorption and newborn formation occurred simultaneously. Lastly, they observed a atypical fragmentation with horizontal fissuring. In this, a horizontal fissure extending across the entire width of epiphysis appears parallel to the growth plate, roughly midway between articular surface and the growth plate. Resorption of the superficial vascular fragment occurs progressively, and thereafter newborn formation proceeds progressively across the entire width of the epiphysis in a centrifugal direction, starting from the deep surface of the horizontal fissure towards the articular surface till the epiphysis is completely reconstituted. Now, when they plotted all these type of fragmentation against the duration of the disease, they saw that bypass fragmentation had a mean duration of disease at 24.3 months, which was almost half the duration of the disease as noted in the typical fragmentation state. Other diseases, other fragmentation types were midway between the two. However, this was not found to be statistically significant when the analysis was done. As far as the outcome of disease based on the spherical deviation score was calculated, all the three patients of complete bypass were in the below 10 range of spherical deviation score. Abortive fragmentation also had majority of the patients with favorable outcome, and atypical had a variable results with majority favoring favored outcomes, and majority of the patients were below the 10 score of SDS. However, atypical fragmentation was not had both good and poor outcomes. The limitations that this study has, that the factors that influence bypassing fragment is avoidance of weight bearing in a post-operative period for 6 months. They have suggested that it is possible that bypassing of the fragmentation noted in this disease may also be related to the stress protection offered by the weight release. And it remains unclear whether similar changes of evolution of the disease with this frequency would follow if any other treatment of containment like Salter enamel osteotomy or a shelf osteoplasty were to be performed, or if early post-operative weight bearing was permitted. Lastly, the sample size in this study is very small, of just 25, and possibly the cause why the correlation of the study were not found to be statistically significant. This following proximal femur osteotomy in a stage of AVN may follow one of 4 patterns with reference to stage of fragmentation, and chances of good outcome appear to be very good if the stage of fragmentation is bypassed. This is the only thing they could be conclusively said. However, duration of disease and the outcome were not statistically significant in this study. Sir. The paper is open for discussion.
Yeah. I think Jayant has asked the first question, which I also wanted to ask. There was a reference to gadolinium scan, profusion scan, and there is no correlation in the results with that. So why was it done? Jayant, that's what you want to ask, right?
Yeah, because there is a lot of concern, and we discussed this in that journal club we had with Professor Kim. Because GAD is deposited in the brain, we know that now,
Right.
And it has uncertain long-term effects. So really,
and in this paper, there is no correlation made to if GAD was so and so, if the perfusion was so, they are more likely to undergo bypass. And there is no indications. They have stuck to their previous indication. And this paper, most of the patient had atypical sort of 12 patients, right, Amol?
Yes, sir. 12 patients.
Out of 50% patient went the way of atypical fragmentation. So the outcome is not known in this And in fact, some of the post-operative X-rays I saw, there was still persistent subluxation. The one of the X-rays which Amol showed. So if you do a early osteotomy and you again get subluxated, what do you do? These are the questions I have. Yes, Sandeep. Yeah.
Yeah. Just I thought it was a very interesting observational study.
Yes.
So they observed after osteotomy in their preset indications what happens and how does the fragmentation progress. So they described it in 4 types,
Right.
but none of them are statistically significant as far as the outcome. That is
Right.
what they have said. That is number 1.
Hmm.
And secondly, they have not done any precision MRIs later. No, they have done only one earlier.
Yeah.
Yes.
In presence of plate, again, it becomes implant. It becomes
I know,
difficult
so
to.
it doesn't make sense to do it earlier also if you can't compare it
Yeah.
later. No?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That was the big idea of doing it earlier.
Yeah.
And again, natural history part, we know that 1/3 of them may not progress to extrusion. And Benjamin's indications are they're doing everybody pre-extrusion.
Right.
So we don't know.
So
Only thing I got from this paper is that okay, somebody has decided to observe how the fragmentation looks like on X-ray.
right. So describe different types of fragmentation, and if possible,
So we
correlate to the
don't
time
know
of
the
healing.
correlation and relevance of that.
Yeah. So we should take this study only up to that significance and leave the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody decided to look at
Taran,
days and how they look like
Yeah.
geographically.
Yeah.
Taran, can I
Amol
make
now,
a
Tushar.
yeah,
Yeah, please.
so few things I had discussed with Hitesh. No? So what I had understood is that the non-weight bearing, what they're doing, is even more than what they have mentioned in the paper. Means their patients are non-weight bearing up to a period of 1 year, and that is what they attribute their good results to. And
So
I think the
Kim,
MRI scan which they have done is to make a sort of confirmation of exactly what stage it is. It's a double confirmation of their Elizabeth Townsend confirmation that they have operated in this stage of the disease only. And I think all the patients which they have included are onset of disease at around 7 years of age. So which means that they are going to go in for a poor prognosis unless operated. That is what their proposition is anyway, right?
No. You're misinterpreting.
Okay.
But they
So they
did
have
not,
not-
they did not use the MRI findings as an indication for whether to operate or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The second thing is what I think is no, see, given the natural history and their indication, if you keep all of them non-weight bearing for 1 year, result would have been the same year. How do you know?
so that
The
is what
idea of
Kim,
permanent containment with varus osteotomy was to allow them early rehabilitation. If after an osteotomy you're keeping somebody non-weight bearing for a year,
in fact, in Kim's protocol, no, Sandeep, the only treatment given is non-weight bearing.
exactly. So then is the osteotomy working or not weight bearing working?
And only patients which are near skeletal maturity, he does that drilling process. But
Yeah,
otherwise, he
found out.
treats everybody just by non-weight bearing.
Yeah, exactly.
So these are the
We're going
questions
back-
we should
Dream
ask.
is
Yeah.
turning back to what it started with.
Right. All right. Any other comments, questions on this? So interesting paper, as Sandeep said, it has good observational value that, these are the types of fragmentation which can take place. And if you bypass the fragmentation when you have operated a patient, then you know that you are in for early healing. There are many questions which this paper raises then answers. And, we should ask, we probably communicate with Hitesh and ask him these questions. Maybe we can get more direct answers then. Okay, so let's go to the next paper then.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Today my paper is on the management of pediatric humerus shaft fractures associated with nerve palsy. The study takes place at the Mayo Clinic, Rochester, and it's a level 4 evidence paper. The aim of this paper was to review the management of pediatric humerus diaphysis fractures. This is a retrospective study in which they searched the records of patients treated between 1996 and 2016. So it's a 20-year-old span. And initially, they found 522 pediatric patients with humerus fractures, of which 96 or 18% of them were shaft fractures. From the 96, they had to exclude 16 patients, 8 of which passed away. 4 had pathological fractures, 3 were perinatal injuries, and 1 patient did not have enough records with them. So they were left with 80 patients. With that, they sorted the data, and they found that, okay, so from the 80 patients, 53 of them were male, 27 were female. The average patient was 10 years old. They conserved 65 of the patients. However, 7 were converted into surgery, so 10% of them due to loss of reduction. In total, they operated on 15 patients. The indications for patients being operated were fracture displacement or angulation, open fractures, patients which needed to improve mobilization due to multiple other injuries, and 1 case of a floating elbow. And they operated with open reduction plating, intramedullary nailing, external fixation, and closed reduction percutaneous spinning. In total, 5 patients had a nerve injury with a motor deficit, with a complete motor deficit. 2 were radial nerve injuries, 1 was ulnar, 1 was median, and 1 patient had a mixed injury. All the patients who had nerve injuries, they occurred in closed fractures, 2 of which went closed reduction and nailing, and 3 were conserved. And in all 5 patients, they had full recovery. The average time of recovery was 154 days, about 5 months. And the recovery, the onset of recovery was 41 days. This is a chart which they included in the paper, and I've highlighted the points which are statistically significant. According to this chart, they show that the operative group was older in general, so 13 years versus 10 years. They had more high energy mechanism of injury. 100% of them had high energy trauma versus 44%. They had more open fractures, and they had more shortening and translation. Before the authors they give any definitive conclusions on this paper, they themselves agree that they are working with limited numbers. They had 80 patients, of which 5 had some form of nerve injury. In fact, in the introduction, they themselves say that this study should be included in a further meta-analysis or systematic review in the future. And they conclude by saying that what they found in this study can help patients in parents counseling patients with the pediatric shaft fractures. Because of 2 points. One, they found that majority of these fractures are treated non-operatively. But however, if you do require an operation, the results are also reliable. And second is that if the patient does have a nerve deficit, there is full recovery with complete motor loss. However, they don't state how long should you wait before you even think about any surgical exploration, because they had only 5 patients, which brings us to the limitations of the study. The one being that there's less numbers. The second thing is that most common indication was that they kept on saying was displacement and or angulation, but there was no consensus on the exact degree or parameters on okay, what is a cutoff point. And one third thing which I found was a bit interesting, or I don't know. So they said that there were 522 patients over 20 years, of which 230 were proximal fractures, 96 were shaft, and 196 were distal fractures. So they're saying that over 20 years, they found 196 distal fractures, but I wish they'd mentioned if that included supracondylar humerus or not, because that brings it to about 10 fractures a year of supracondylar humerus. So I don't know if they included those kinds in this data or not. With that, the paper is open for discussion. Thank you.
Pawan, there were 96 staff, and out of the 96, 16 were excluded because either they
Yes,
died
sir.
or so they have included only shaft femur. The distal humerus fractures are not included in this study.
No, no, no.
Not included. Only shaft
No.
humerus are included. So they had 80
Only
shaft
shaft.
humerus, out of which 5 had a nerve injury.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's almost 6 or 7% incidence of nerve injury in a humerus shaft fracture, and most
Yes.
of them, all of them recovered on their own without any exploration, whether the patient was treated conservatively or operatively. That's the message.
Correct. With an average being 5 months of recovery.
Yeah. So shaft humerus are as such rare in children, and among them, nerve injury will be even rarer. And that's why this data, even though it's from a good center over 20 years, this is all information we have about this fracture. Any comments from anybody on this? Sandeep, sorry, collectively you seem to be having maximum experience with humerus shaft fractures. So say something. Okay. I don't see him around. Okay, so if there are no comments, then we go back to the next paper, I think. Jayant is going to present his supracondylar paper. Jayant, can you share your screen? Okay.
You can see my screen.
Absolutely.
So this is a fairly important paper in the evolution of the thought process about what to do about a pulseless supracondylar humerus fracture. And this is a multi-center study from 4 centers in the US. Includes big names like John Flynn and David Skaggs, who've been doing a lot of the seminal work on supracondylar fractures. So it was published in January 2019. So the background is that 20% of displaced supracondylar fractures have vascular compromise. About 11 to 16% of them have nerve injuries. So there was this paper from Mangat et al. From Birmingham Children's Hospital in the UK, published in JBJS 2009. And they said that if you have a pulseless pink hand, but with a median or anterior introsseous nerve palsy, you have to open it. So 7 of 7 patients in their series with this particular, so pulseless supracondylar with a nerve injury, they said that there was some entrapment of the nerve or vessel. So they ended up opening all 7 of them. And then I think Skaggs and co-workers basically said, that's not our experience. Let's have a look at a larger number of patients with this particular clinical pattern, and then see really do they all need opening. So they wanted to look at the incidence of median or intraosseous nerve palsy in pulseless supracondylar fractures. What was the rate of surgical exploration in these cases? They wanted to report the long-term results of this particular pattern of injury. And what were the factors that influenced the decision of whether to open the fracture or not? So the Mangat paper was the basis behind the study. And I think that's a very good way of going about doing research. So they did a retrospective chart review of all Gartland 3 and 4 fractures from 2000 to 2014 from 4 pediatric trauma centers in the United States. So the inclusion criteria was that you had to have an absent radial pulse by the palpation method, and you have to have clinical signs of median or anterior introsseous nerve palsy. They looked at demographic info, injury characteristics, associated injuries, what procedure was actually done, and any complications they encountered. They also looked at what was the timing of the injury, time to surgery, what is the time to nerve recovery, and also what was the outcome. And the decision whether to open reduce or convert to open after closed reduction was at the discretion of the treating surgeon. Remember that this is a retrospective study, so they did not specify any criteria as to when to open, and that's obviously a major flaw in the study or a limitation. So they defined poor perfusion status as a child who had at least one of the following criteria: a cold distal extremity on examination, a pale distal extremity on examination, or if the capillary refill was more than 2 seconds. And they then did fairly standard statistical analysis. So they had 71 patients in this particular series, about 10 times the number from the Mangat paper. The average age was 6.8 years, which is, I think, the normal range. Average duration of follow-up was 8 months, which is again in keeping with supracondylar studies. So 56% of the patients had a median nerve injury and 44% had an anterior intraosseous nerve injury. Some of them had multiple palsies. So there was some overlap between these two groups, but it's fairly evenly distributed between total median nerve injury or a isolated anterior intraosseous. So 52 patients out of 71 had only a closed reduction. So remember that this is patients who have a pink pulseless hand with nerve palsy. And 19 patients required an open reduction. And there was a huge skew in between the different sites. And one site only contributed one patient in the entire 14-year period, whereas another site contributed 35 patients out of the 71. So that again skews data, and there's also a difference between the sites in the rate of opening. So that's something to bear in mind when you read this paper. So looking at the closed reduction group, closed reduction percutaneous pinning was sufficient in 96% of cases. Only 2 patients who initially underwent closed reduction percutaneous pinning actually required further surgery. The time to surgery was 9 hours. And in this group, no subsequent vascular procedures were required. 28 of the 52 had immediate return of the radial pulse. 14 had no pulse post-reduction, but good perfusion. And in 10 cases, that was not documented. Again, it's a retrospective study. So the 2 patients who required reoperation in the closed reduction group, one had a late redisplacement because they fell again 2 weeks post-op, and one required a fasciotomy for compartment syndrome. But there were no vascular or nerve procedures in this group who had good perfusion post-reduction. So the reasons for open reduction is a lot of different reasons and even distribution of cases between all of these indications for open reduction. So there were 10 median and 9 anterior intraosseous nerve injuries, total of 19 patients in the open reduction group. The time to surgery was 19 hours, but they actually had one outlier who had surgery 136 hours. So if you took this outlier out, there was no difference in the time to surgery between the closed and open reduction group. And these were the intra-op findings. There was injury to the nerve or artery in only 6 patients. So 6 out of 71 patients of the total group had actual injury to the nerve or artery. Rest of them were for other reasons. So what was actually done? Only 3 patients in total actually had an arterial procedure performed of the 71 cases. The other reasons for opening were nothing to do with the median or anterior intraosseous nerve injury or the injury to the brachial artery. So who needed vascular repair or soft tissue detethering? So none of the closed reduction group ultimately ended up requiring exploration of the artery. So the need for vascular repair was not affected by any of the factors they looked at. So there was no difference between whether you had a single nerve palsy, multiple nerve palsy, whether you had anterior intraosseous or median. And there was no difference between closed or open reduction or the type of nerve palsy you had on your pre-op nerve state, perfusion status. So the type of nerve injury you had did not really influence whether you had a warm pink hand or whether you had a cold hand. So compartment syndrome did have some correlation. If you had a poor perfusion status pre-op, you were much more likely to develop compartment syndrome. And if there was a delay in treatment, again, child had much more likely to develop a compartment syndrome. So in terms of neurological recovery, there was no difference between open or closed reduction. And even in the outcome, in terms of range of movement and Bowman angle, there was no difference between open or closed reduction. So poor perfusion pre-op warrants urgent closed reduction. And if the post-reduction perfusion continues to be poor, then you need to explore. And surgical exploration or vascular nerve reconstruction will be required only in about 15% of pulseless supracondylar fractures with the nerve palsy. So it's much less than the number reported by the Mangat paper. Limitations are that closed and open reduction patients represent different ends of a spectrum. It's a retrospective study and there was some loss to follow up. So the conclusions that I drew from this paper are that open reduction will be necessary in about 1/3 of pulseless supracondylar fractures with the median nerve palsy. That's much higher, about 6 times as much as the 5% rate, which is quoted for typical supracondylar fractures, type 3 and 4. Compartment decompression will be needed in about 10% of cases, and vascular exploration will be required in 15% of this particular clinical scenario. And really, clinical perfusion of the limb, not pulse. So perfusion of the limb, both pre-op and post-reduction, is really the key which will guide you as to whether open reduction will be required. Paper is open for discussion.
Jen, thanks for reviewing that paper. What were the indications for exploring the vessels? So basically, when you have a child now with the pink pulseless and with anterior atrocious nerve palsy, how are you going to decide whether you're going to proceed with closed reduction or the child will require open reduction or will require a vascular and nerve intervention? How do you know?
So it's all to do with perfusion of the limb. So if you have a cold or a pale extremity, and
then it's not a pink pulseless hand. No, then it's not a pink pulseless hand.
No, this is pulseless supra. No, it's not pink pulseless. Sorry, this is a pulseless supracondylar. It's very clearly specified. It's a pulseless supracondylar. Yeah, because many of these pulseless supracondylars, after the reduction, will become pink. Even a white hand will become pink. So we are just looking at a larger group. So this is not just pink pulseless hand, but these are pulseless supracondylar fractures. Whether they are pink or white is, that is a distinction you will make after the reduction. So the entry criteria into the study is a pulseless supracondylar fracture, and they did not use Doppler. Okay, so when they added so this is on clinical examination. So the other important thing which they found, but they didn't have enough statistics to justify it, was that adding a Doppler to the equation did not really change the outcome. So you are still relying on clinical examination of the limb, both pre-op and immediately in the OT. You are relying on clinical examination to determine whether after the reduction and pinning, you have a pink warm hand that is well perfused. Right. If you have that, then you're good. You don't have to go and explore it. So I think it's a good paper in that they have good numbers of this very rare but important and anxiety-provoking clinical scenario for most orthopedic surgeons. And they are giving us some measure of what are the odds of this going on to requiring a vascular exploration, which is again, is another difficult scenario for us because then we need to call a vascular surgeon, etc. So I think it's a good paper in that it has helped to clarify, but really we need a prospective study now with much more tightly defined criteria. Sandeep?
Jen?
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Sandeep say, and then Tushar after Sandeep.
Okay, so I thought, Jayant, it was a beautifully dissected out paper by you. I enjoyed that very much. The second thing was that what happened was that the Mangat paper created a bias saying that if you have a concomitant median and pulseless hand, it becomes mandatory to explore, which is not true. So, in fact, most of the times when we do a close reduction, if the criteria should be if there is a gap on your X-ray. So the indication for exploration was either a cold hand or a poorly perfused hand or an inadequate reduction where you are having a feeling of an interposition. If there is a evidence of interposition on your reduction, that is the only mandatory criteria to do an open reduction. Pure nerve injury with a pulseless hand is not an absolute indication for doing an open reduction. That is what I feel. The perfusion is the
Agree.
king, and
Absolutely
the
agree.
fracture reduction is the king.
Yes. So 3 criteria: good perfusion, good perfusion, good reduction without a gap. If you get that, then you don't need to explore or open, right?
Yeah, but always monitor them very closely because compartment syndrome is a problem that happens more often in this particular group. So we really need to watch them very closely in the postoperative period.
So we had a patient just last week, with pink pulseless hand with median nerve palsy. And Jaideep can tell you about this because this was referred from a center saying that SpO2 is only 86. And we thought even perfusion was not good. But by the time patient reached the hospital, the perfusion was good, but the median nerve palsy was there. And I think Jaideep treated it by close reduction and pinning. The difference is, I'll tell you, these patients have more pain post-operatively, and they have more swelling also, and they need to be observed carefully and need to be kept in the hospital for a longer time. So this patient went home uneventfully without any compartment syndrome, and we are just watching for the median nerve palsy. The pulse was good when the patient was discharged. So they are a different group of patient with more severe injury.
And it's very good from a practicing orthopedic surgeon point of view that all these other measures, arteriography and Doppler and even SpO2, they're all not in the equation at all. Just look at clinical perfusion. That's very good for us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, sir, for treating orthopedic surgeon, as sir say, so she presented with absent pulse, intraoperative, we did a good reduction, still radial pulse is absent, we did a color Doppler, USG intraop, that show flow is good, but the waveform is not good. So we have suspected, as sir says, the next day morning she has profuse swelling, so we just given the slab in 40-degree flexion. On 2 days of still she has no pulse. On fifth post-op day, she has a good bounding pulse. So that's the only thing, if you are suspecting clinically, to observe closely for at least 48 hours.
So there is a Ganga Hospital paper which says that the pulse may not come for as much as 6 months after the index surgery.
Yeah.
Then there are a couple of papers which give enough credibility to pulse oximetry. Now, I think in the POSI meeting and couple of in the IFIX talk, I think it was presented, that paper was shown that pulse oximetry waveform is a very good way, not the one which we use at home to see our SpO2, but a part of the monitor system. And I feel what Sandeep mentioned is inadequate, suboptimal close reduction. Anybody who does a close reduction will feel a very clear snap of the reduction. And if you don't feel a clear snap of the reduction and there is a clear interposition, that means it's better to open. I just want to ask one question: is there is a difference between opening and reducing and actually exploring the brachial artery along with the vascular surgery? So how do we ascertain? Means every time we open, should we ask a vascular surgeon to be standby, or we can just open, remove the soft tissue, reduce the fracture, pin the fracture, and then wait and watch? What is the consensus on that after this paper?
See, the reason to open in those two instances is completely different. So if you are opening for failure to achieve reduction, then you have then that is for non-vascular reasons. So you're not even going to look at the artery or nerve because limb is clinically well perfused. So you've just failed to achieve a reduction, the soft tissue interposition. So go ahead and open it. That's fine. So here we are looking at whether you're going to open the fracture for vascular exploration. Because even nerve injuries, vast majority of them get better. You don't need to, for an isolated nerve injury, you'd never explore a supracondylar fracture. You'd never open a supracondylar fracture. So here we are looking at vascular exploration only. And the only clinical factor which is going to determine whether you open for vascular exploration is clinical perfusion of the limb. So that this is a very clear message that's coming out from the paper.
So, what exact clinical parameter now do we have to understand that when I go in, I should have a vascular surgeon with me 100%?
That will never, you'll never get that answer. You will never get
No,
that answer.
the only indication is a pale hand
Yeah,
with
pale
no
hand.
pulse,
Pale hand with no pulse. So though
or
that
a compound
merits,
fracture with transection.
But
Which means-
remember that 28 of 52 patients who had closed reduction in this series, right? 28 of 52 is almost 75%. Once you reduced and pinned it, perfusion came back, right? So you have to understand that if you call the vascular surgeon with a pale hand, you will end up, not needing him more than 50% of the time.
Jayant, one minute. So
Sorry.
you are saying these were pulseless hands. Not all of them were pink or pale. Have they differentiate between pink hands and pale hands?
That's a good question. I didn't. I need to go back and look at the paper now.
Because
good.
yeah, they have not differentiated. So actually the pathway will be those which were pink hand, what happened to them, and those which were pale hand, obviously you will call a vascular surgeon standby, try to reduce it. A third group of patients, Jayant, third group of patient which is missed in many papers is which is a pink pulseless hand or a pink hand with pulse, and after reduction becomes pulseless and pale.
Okay, I will just go back and look at this, and next week I will report if that information is there, because that will help us to tune the algorithm even better.
Right. Okay. Any other comments? I think it's a very
so
well presented
Tarun,
paper. Yeah,
So we are now at that APOA, we are presenting our paper on what we call as the disappearing pulse supracondylar hand. So we have these cohort of 10 patients over this last 5 years, which we had. The pulse disappeared after we attempted to reduce. And in all those patients, we made a small anterior incision and made blunt dissection and just removed the soft tissue interposition.
But again, were they perfused without pulse or not
So
perfused?
they all had a disappearance of pulse and a poor pulse oximetry intra-op. Means we immediately put the pulse SpO2 and the waveform was bad. And the moment we removed the soft tissue, we got a firm reduction and a complete restoration of the pulse oximetry. So we are merely saying that that's a separate entity, and if there is a present pulse, but if you reduce and the pulse disappears in front of you, then it's a small effort to just make a small incision, remove that soft tissue interposition rather than risk waiting, watching, and then maybe 5% or 7% will go into stretch pain compartment syndrome, because then the pulse has disappeared because of your close reduction, not otherwise.
Have you published this work, Tushar?
No, so we are presenting in APOA, so now we are supposed to be publishing it. So,
yeah. So next week I'll be discussing SpO2. There's one SpO2 paper.
Tushar, what was the quality of your reduction?
So all the patient had a very blunt, soft. You could clearly feel that there is something in between. There is an interposition, and they were not a firm endpoint reduction.
No, that becomes very subjective. What I'm saying is on radiology, on your CM, AP and lateral view, was there
they all had an anterior gap, or they would have
had an anterior gap, so that is inadequate reduction because of soft tissue interposition.
Yeah. But simultaneously the pulse is disappeared.
No, but that is what I'm saying, that is an okay indication to explore.
So what I am saying is not merely on the basis of the suboptimal reduction, but as a routine we do a SpO2 pulse oximetry pre-op. Then we reduce and we see the SpO2, and the waveform disappears and the pulse also disappears. And the saturation is ill received. So we verify it, we wait for a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, and if it's not coming, then we make a small anteromedial incision. And even with gentle digital dissection, finger dissection, or with a mosquito, you can just remove that soft tissue. You can very clearly see it or feel it coming over that anteromedial spike. You just remove it, and it just then the reduction is so much better. It fits firmly, snaps in firmly, and you fix it. What we are saying is it's called disappearing pulse supracondylar. The pulse was present when you received the patient, but the pulse disappeared because of your effort of close reduction.
No, what I fail to understand is when you are bringing the fragments together and your reduction is not, means why would if it has to disappear, it happens at time of injury.
No, so this is what we are saying, that there is a separate entity which disappears because of close reduction. But there are very few, means in period, a matter of half a decade, I have only 10 patients.
I had one patient, Sandeep, similar patient. We reduced it. This was a patient from a consulate actually. And after reduction, this was done in the afternoon. At night, the child had severe pain. He had anterior intraosseous nerve palsy. When we took post-operative X-ray, there was a gap, and the pulse was not felt. And I had to go down again, and actually the vessel was tethered. There was a fibrous tissue which was kinking the vessel, and we just released it, and everything came back.
Inadequate reduction, no?
Inadequate reduction. Yeah. So inadequate reduction because of interposition. Possibly.
Yeah. So that is an indication which I said that if there is inadequate reduction, anterior gap, yes, but you can't say that well-reduced fracture may pulse disappears after reduction.
No.
So it falls under the of inadequate reduction only. There is
Yeah. So
if after a good reduction you don't feel it, may be spasm, it will go away after some time.
Yeah, there is a possibility to what you are saying, because my fellow who is writing the paper was in Ganga, and then they refused to believe him, and they have not opened. They have just done the close reduction and pinned, and after an hour the pulse was restored.
What
what
I'm
you
saying
say,
is that
Sandeep-
it's a good thing to write up. Don't make it dramatic by saying disappearing pulse and all. It is inadequate reduction
Okay, fine, I got it.
for a paper.
just look at intra-op Siam images, no? And
Yes.
that should be working there.
Chalo, bye.
Yeah.
So great,
Okay.
interesting discussion. So excellent. So let's meet again next Tuesday with 4 more papers. I would request Varun that we send papers well in advance so that we can select. And thank you everyone, and have a safe week.
Let's remain healthy.
Let's hope that everyone is there to have this continue.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Take care, guys.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.